In the late 1980s, a billionaire owned a ranch in Montana. The land had been declining after years of cattle ranching. Anyone else would have tightened control and increased the herds. Instead, he made a decision that many ranchers called madness. He began tearing down fences and bringing in dozens of bison. Rather than managing every acre, he simply stepped back and let nature work on its own. His name was Ted Turner. A decade later, the consequences of his decision had spread far beyond a single ranch. Bison had spread across millions of acres in 6 states. Their numbers had grown to 45,000 head, and lands considered exhausted for decades had begun recovering on their own. But the greatest surprise was still to come. Flying D Ranch, Montana, autumn 1989. Turner stood to the side and watched. He had been waiting for this moment for 30 years. His first bison had come into his life back in 1976 on a small farm in Florida. But one bison on a farm is not saving a species. For that, he needed Montana, the land where bison had lived in their millions and where none had roamed for 100 years. At 51, he bought it. He was the founder of CNN, the man who had changed world television. The only thing he cared about right now was what the animals were doing on the other side of that fence. The gates opened. Ranch manager Russ Miller recalls that the bison stood motionless at first. Most of them had come from government pens and had never seen an open horizon. They were born behind fences, raised behind fences. The entire prior history of their species, 60 million animals moving as a single organism across a continent, lived somewhere in their memory, but had never had anywhere to go. A few minutes of silence. Then the herd moved. Turner simply watched as the land between the Gallatin and the Madison took back what had been taken from it 100 years before.
And even then, he understood that there would be no stopping. Flying D Ranch in 1989 looked like most Montana ranches. A flat carpet of a single type of grass, compacted soil, silted rivers, land that gave less and less with each passing year. But nobody understood why. The answer was simple, and it was 100 years old. Before the 1860s, the Great Plains were home to 60 million bison, the architects of an ecosystem. Bison hooves broke up the surface layer of soil, creating microcavities where water could penetrate. Rolling on the ground, they carved out depressions, wallows that after rain became temporary pools where insects, frogs, and aquatic plants came to life. Grazing unevenly, they left patches of varying height, and in that variation, dozens of bird species made their homes. Seeds caught in their thick coats and traveled tens of kilometers. The bison seeded the steppe with its own body. Over 20 years between 1860 and 1880, all of that was destroyed. The herds were nearly wiped out entirely. In 1886, a National Museum expedition arrived in Montana and found that fewer than 1,000 wild bison remained across all of North America. From 60 million, the steppe remained, but everything that had made it alive was gone. A monoculture of grasses instead of a mosaic, compacted soil instead of fertility, silence instead of migration. Flying D was an exact replica of that simplification. The morning after the gates opened, bison tracks led east. They were already exploring. In the first weeks, the animals spread across all 113,000 acres. Selectively. Some areas they trampled, others they avoided. Where they grazed, they left bare earth and dung. Where they rolled, they dug hollows. Turner watched and did not yet know he was watching something nobody had seen here for 100 years.
The first results did not appear immediately, but the following spring, researchers began noticing things they initially had no explanation for. A cow grazes uniformly. It eats everything in its path, cutting grass in an even front down to the root, compacting soil with the same weight step after step. Year after year, a monocultural carpet with no variety whatsoever. A bison grazes differently. It moves across large areas, does not consume everything in reach, leaves patches untouched, and returns months later when the grass has grown back. Uneven grazing creates variation in height. Variation in height means dozens of microhabitats where different species can live. And there was something else discovered only in retrospect. In the spring after the first season at Flying D, researchers noticed something strange. In certain areas of the steppe, there was standing water, small depressions full after rain. Insects were already floating in them. Birds had settled on their edges. Frogs appeared that had not been seen in the area for years. The bison had done this. They had built ponds and reshaped the terrain. A ton of living weight rolling in the dust hundreds of times a season carves a depression up to 1 meter deep, a natural water-collecting bowl. The human eye sees damaged land. Ecologists saw something else, a mechanism the steppe had lacked for 100 years, and without which it had been slowly dying. A study published in PNAS recorded the result. Grasslands where bison were reintroduced showed a doubling of plant diversity over 29 years, and that diversity held even through the most severe droughts. At Flying D, a chain reaction began within the first years. Where grass recovered, prairie dogs returned.
Animals that traditional ranchers had been exterminating as pests. Where prairie dogs appeared, burrowing owls and foxes followed. Bison, wolves, and grizzly bears began moving again across the land between the Gallatin and the Madison. Flying D had become something that had not existed in Montana for 100 years. A functioning ecosystem where predators and prey lived together without human management. The first thing Turner did at Flying D was take down fences. Almost all of the interior fencing across 113,000 acres was removed so the land could breathe as a single unbroken expanse. Then he removed the cattle. Then the haying equipment and the irrigation infrastructure. He hired ecologists and biologists instead of agronomists. Local ranchers could not believe it. Cattle were Montana, an identity, and this man from Atlanta had simply taken the cattle out. People said he hates cows. In reality, he was simply doing different arithmetic. Turner's response was straightforward. Bison graze better on this land, do not degrade the soil the same way, and produce meat that is healthier for people. The idea he was putting into practice had no clear name in American agriculture in 1989. What he was doing would later be called rewilding and eco-capitalism. Turner used both terms and coined the second himself. The first problem came from where it was expected. Montana legally classified bison as livestock, not as wildlife. Perimeter fencing, veterinary oversight, restrictions on movement. Turner wanted wild nature. The state was giving him ranching with large animals. It seemed like that should have stopped him, but Flying D was only the first proof of what he had suspected from the beginning, that restoring nature requires scale.
One ranch cannot save a species. Bison need space to migrate, genetic diversity, a network of ecosystems connected to one another. To bring the animal back, you have to bring back the landscape. From 1990, he began buying bison from producers across North America, assembling a composite herd with the broadest possible genetic base. At the same time, he was buying land. Each new ranch closed another gap in the ecosystem. By the mid-1990s, the herd already numbered in the thousands, spread across several states. In the late 1990s, Turner bought his first ranch in Nebraska, then several more until nearly 500,000 acres in the Sandhills region were under his management. 5 separate ranches, all converted to bison and grass management. Local people were alarmed. From Orr to Ogallala, people were saying one thing: Turner is buying everything up. They believed he was trying to gain control of the land above the Ogallala Aquifer in order to seize power over water in the arid West. Cindy Weller, a ranch owner near Mullen, said there is this anxiety about him. Turner responded publicly.
He was not selling water rights and had no intention of doing so. And on the Sandhills lands, the same thing was happening as at Flying D. Bison had replaced cattle, interior fences had come down, and the soil had begun to recover. A decade later, even skeptics acknowledged it. The bison population in the state had grown substantially due to Turner, and the pastures where bison grazed looked different from neighboring ones. The grass more varied, the soil softer, the bird life richer. In 1992, Turner bought Ladder Ranch, 156,000 acres in the mountains of Sierra County, New Mexico, for a single purpose: the Mexican gray wolf.
It was the rarest subspecies of gray wolf in North America. When the recovery program began in 1997, fewer than 50 remained anywhere on the planet. Ladder Ranch became the only private facility where wolves were born in captivity, learned to hunt, and were prepared for life in the wild before release. For 17 years, the program ran without incident. Then, in 2015, the New Mexico Game Commission, a governor-appointed body openly hostile to the wolf recovery program, denied Ladder Ranch's permit renewal for the first time in 17 years. They did so without warning. They made a strange decision, denying a long-standing program with no problems. "I would have preferred they had acted differently," said Turner Endangered Species Fund Director Mike Phillips. Turner appealed. The program stalled for months. Wolves in captivity waited for release. The commission denied it again. Eventually, the permit was restored, but the time had been lost. Several wolves died in captivity during the bureaucratic standoff. The recovery program continued, but this episode demonstrated what Turner had known from the start. The greatest enemy of nature restoration is not a shortage of land or a lack of money. It is bureaucracy and local politics. So, in 1996, he chose an even harder path. Turner and Jane Fonda bought Vermejo Park Ranch from the oil company Pennzoil, 558,000 acres on the border between New Mexico and Colorado. What they received was a disaster. The land was severely degraded from overgrazing, deforestation, coal mining, oil and gas extraction, railroads, and decades of complete absence of conservation management. Giant charcoal kilns from the 19th century still stood in the middle of a former mining town.
Rivers had been poisoned by extraction, and on top of all that, at the time of sale, Penso had retained mineral rights to the land. Turner could restore the soil and bring back bison, but at any moment the oil company had the legal right to arrive and begin drilling. Turner accepted those terms. A herd appeared at Vermejo. More than 1,200 bison, including the Castle Rock herd, a genetically unique group that had lived on that land since the 1920s. The results were striking. Rio Grande cutthroat trout, a fish that had disappeared from most rivers in the region, began returning to the restored waterways. Rare native plants appeared on meadows that had previously held nothing but erosion, not because they were planted, but because the bison had changed the structure of the soil and water had begun to stay in the ground again. The progression of the herd reflected the scale of the vision. By the mid-2000s, the network spanned 13 ranches in 6 states. At Flying D, 4,500 bison on that ranch alone. At Vermejo, more than 1,200. The rest were distributed across Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota, and other Montana ranches. At its peak, more than 50,000 bison on 16 ranches in 6 states, the largest private herd in the world. 1/10 of all bison in North America in the hands of one man. In 2002, Turner opened the Ted's Montana Grill restaurant chain. The idea seemed absurd. Americans ate beef. Bison was an exotic item for tourists. Turner's answer was purely economic. Bison cannot compete as cattle as an idea, but it can as a product if there is a market. The market created a bison market. The market gave other ranchers an incentive to raise bison. More ranchers with bison meant a broader gene pool, a more resilient population, more land where bison replaced cattle.
By making bison a commodity, he encouraged people to go into bison ranching, which dramatically expanded the gene pool and made the population extraordinarily healthy, said chain co-founder George McCarrow. He was criticized. People said you could not simultaneously save an animal and sell its meat. Turner's reply: "If bison have no economic value, they will disappear. If they do, they will survive." Today, the chain has 37 restaurants in 14 states. But a different number matters more. The total bison population of North America has grown from fewer than 1,000 in 1889 to approximately 500,000 today. 1/10 of those are Turner's herd. A significant share of the rest are ranchers inspired by his example who needed a market to sell into. Then, in 2007, brucellosis broke out in Yellowstone, a disease that bison could theoretically transmit to cattle on neighboring ranches. Animals that crossed outside park boundaries were subject to shooting. In 2008, more than 1,400 animals died that way in a single season. Federal agencies launched a quarantine program, trapping bison, holding them in pens in Paradise Valley in southern Montana, and testing them for the disease for years. Up to $250,000 per year was spent on their upkeep. The Fort Belknap and Fort Peak reservations asked for the animals to be transferred to them and were refused. The bison sat in pens and waited. In 2009, Turner intervened. He took 88 animals to Flying D, onto a separate section along the Madison River. Ted became the first private owner of Yellowstone bison when they thundered through gates on the west bank of the Madison and disappeared into the hills. These were direct descendants of the last free herds on the continent, genetically unique animals that existed nowhere else.
But brucellosis remained a problem. Turner hired veterinarians in a private laboratory, Newport Laboratories. Together, they created the world's first vaccine developed specifically for bison. In 2014, part of the offspring, 139 animals, was transferred to the Fort Peak Reservation. The vaccine against mycoplasma that his team had developed after 1,000 animals died was given to the National Bison Association without charge. The problem that had nearly destroyed his herd became a tool for protecting all bison in North America. Ted Turner died on May 6, 2026. He was 87, but Flying D Ranch, between the Gallatin and the Madison, the land he bought exhausted in 1989, is alive. Wolves, grizzly bears, bison, pronghorn, prairie dogs, and eagles live there together today without a planting plan or species target quotas, simply because Turner took down the fences, removed the cattle, and gave the land time. The pronghorn returned, the fastest land mammal in the New World. It runs at up to 90 kilometers an hour, a speed no current predator in its range requires it to reach. That speed was preserved against predators that went extinct here 10,000 years ago. The pronghorn is still running from ghosts, and the fact that it runs means the evolutionary memory of this land is intact. The total bison population of North America stands at approximately 500,000. The Turner Endangered Species Fund continues its work with the black-footed ferret, the Mexican gray wolf, the Bolson tortoise, and the Rio Grande cutthroat trout. The Turner Institute of Eco-Agriculture, the organization to which he transferred his lands so they would not be sold off after his death, has a single purpose: to ensure that what Turner began does not stop with him.